What we want to do today would be to welcome our panelists for this panel entitled Pork, Religion and Identity. So we have three very distinguished speakers today who I will just introduce all at once. So first up would be Dr. Aaron Gross, who is an assistant professor of theology and religious studies at the University of San Diego. He is also the author of The Question of Animal and Religion, Theoretical Stakes and Practical Applications. And he'll be sharing his paper with us today. Our second speaker is Professor Jordan Rosenblum, who is the Belzer Professor of Classical Judaism at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he is the author of Food and Identity in Early Rabbinic Judaism. And our final speaker has plenty of talents. Mr. Jeffrey Yoskowitz is a journalist, he's an author. He's also a chef, and he's the publisher of the website, The Pork Memoirs. So I will, without further ado, hand it over to the first speaker to join us. Thank you.
Let's come up. Yeah. So good morning, everyone. I found last night's panel particularly remarkable, and I decided to modify my remarks so that I could directly engage it. What I was originally gonna do here, and in some sense I will still do that, is talk about the new subfield of animals and religion. I'm working under the assumption that I'm one of the few people in religious studies in the room. In the last 15 years, we've really had a vibrant conversation start, and there's some very valuable insights coming out of that. And my original idea was to give you a kind of overview of some of these things and then point them towards the pig. But in many ways, what I'm going to do really is just start utilizing those insights and demonstrate what their value might be, how they might help us think about these questions differently. So returning to the panel, this evening when I was kind of trying to characterize in my own head why I found it so stimulating, the adjective that kept coming to my mind was symphonic. It was kind of like a symphony. And what I mean by that was each presenter, hit a particular note, had a particular voice, and at first those voices sounded discordant, as is the case with really good music. And then by the end of the evening, there was something that was holding it together, at least for me, experientially. And why a symphony, why that metaphor? Well, what do we say when we have really beautiful music? We talk about it as moving, as powerful. Somehow, when we bring certain voices together, the elements of them congeal to produce something that moves us in a way the individual elements won't. Now, as I said, this is a simple observation about what I experienced. And what I want to do here is explore why I might have experienced that sense of symphony amongst these diverse voices. And maybe some of you will have emphasized with that. And to do that, I want to utilize the work of Jacques Derrida and draw out some of its implications. To anticipate, my conclusion will be quite simple, namely that the conflict between vegan and omnivore, as it is often created, as profound as it is, as much attention as I think it is worth, is not the most important conflict before us. And mistaking this conflict as something that's more central than it is assists and helps the survival of the factory farm. So to help us think about these conflicts between vegan and omnivore, between the factory farm and its alternative, Derrida tells a kind of story. That's how I'm going to attempt to frame it. A story about how Western civilization has come to think about and treat animals differently in the course of the last 2 centuries. I'm going to begin with a substantial quote. Everybody knows what the production, breeding, transport, and slaughter of these animals has become. Instead of thrusting these images in your faces or awakening them in your memory, something that would be both too easy and endless, let me simply say a word about this pathos. If these images are pathetic, if they evoke sympathy, it is also because they pathetically open the immense question of pathos and the pathological, precisely that is of suffering, pity, and compassion, and the place that has to be accorded to the interpretation of this compassion, to the sharing of this suffering among the living, to the law, ethics, and politics that must be brought to bear upon this experience of compassion. What has been happening for 2 centuries now involves a new experience of this compassion. So Derrida takes this word compassion, and he uses it to name something that he argues has always been with us, but that we are experiencing in a new way, interpreting in a new way. So what is this new experience of compassion? He writes, in response to what is, for the moment, the irresistible but unacknowledged unleashing and the organized disavowal of this torture, and here he's referring to factory farming, the organized disavowal of this torture, voices are raised. Minority, weak, marginal voices, little assured of their discourse, of their right to discourse, and of the enactment of their discourse within the law as a declaration of rights in order to protest, in order to appeal to what is still presented in such a problematic way as animal rights, in order to awaken us to our responsibilities and our obligations vis-a-vis the living in general, and precisely to this fundamental compassion. So the new experience of compassion is a response to a new kind of disavowal of animal lives, a new kind of violence to animals. And the culminating material correlate of that manifestation is the factory farm. So Derrida has a kind of longer history of how he's thinking about the factory farm. It goes back 2 centuries. Derrida then moves us to talk about the shift. And he uses Jeremy Bentham here, the founder of utilitarian thinking, as a kind of symbol and exemplar of this new experience of compassion, what he calls a problematic shift. And he ultimately comes to identify this with a war, a term that's going to be important. Now, Derrida does not see any clear line of progress. I want to make that clear because this quote, taken out of context, could give you that sense, but rather a kind of endless conflict between different positions around animals that has taken a particular shape in the last 2 centuries. He writes, it is in thinking of the source and ends of this compassion that about 2 centuries ago, someone like Bentham, as is well known, proposed changing the very form of the question regarding the animal, that domesticated discourse within the tradition, that it dominated, interesting slip, that dominated discourse within the tradition, in the language both of its most refined philosophical argumentation and of everyday acceptation. That is high speech, what we sometimes call, and the common language we speak. In both of these discourses, we had a kind of new thing happening. Bentham said something like this, Derrida writes, the question is not to know whether the animal can think, reason, or speak, etc., something we still pretend to be asking ourselves. The first and decisive question would rather be to know whether animals can suffer. Can they suffer, asks Bentham, simply, yet so profoundly. No one can deny the suffering, fear, or panic, the terror or fright that can seize certain animals and that we humans can witness. Let us note the following. The response to the question, can they suffer, leaves no room for doubt. In fact, it has never left room for doubt. That is why the experience that we have of it is not even indubitable. It precedes the indubitable. It is older than it. No doubt either, then, of there being with us the possibility of giving vent to a surge of compassion, even if it is then misunderstood, repressed, or denied, held at bay. Before the undeniability of this response, yes, they suffer like us, who suffer for them and with them. Before this response that precedes all other questions, both ground and cornerstone of this shift. The 2 centuries I have been referring to somewhat casually in order to situate the present in terms of this tradition have been those of an unequal struggle, a war whose inequality could one day be reversed, being waged between, on the one hand, those who violate not only animal life, but even and also this sentiment of compassion, and on the other hand, those who appeal for an irrefutable testimony to this pity. War is waged over the matter of pity. This war is probably ageless, but, and here is my hypothesis, it is passing through a critical phase. We are passing through that phase. and it passes through us. So before I move on to gloss Derrida, let me just refresh our memory about some of the voices on the panel. And I'm going to uplift 2 voices just because I can't touch on all 7 and do a more thorough kind of bringing them together. The first one I want to uplift is the voice that Terry Spence brought to the table. And folks will remember that Mr. Spence identified himself as a farmer, a self-identified true farmer, somebody who is a fighter of the factory farm, and someone who spoke rather eloquently, I thought, about the intolerability of the factory farm from the perspective of the true farmer, and spoke rather powerfully about the respect for animals that seems so central to his own way of looking at it. And the other voice I want to lift up is that of Bob Kamhi, who, as former pig farmer turned vegetable farmer and vegan, challenged us that even these ethical questions that we try to raise are insufficient to the ontological reality of the pig. I'm just going to say the pigness of the pig. The pigness of the pig somehow launches us beyond ethics. We somehow have a response that precedes ethics. And that response for Kamhi means the pig is inviolable. It means he cannot eat the pig. So these are 2 voices which in the popular discourse are often kind of pitted against one another, 2 sophisticated versions of voices that are often pitted against one another. And we might wonder if the war Derrida speaks about is between these voices, between the person who cannot accept that the pig can be violated and the person who sees that acceptable within a context of respect. But I don't think that's the case. So Derrida argues that we're in a war in a critical phase. I think we all here know that the stakes are enormous. I appreciate the way Barry Estabrook put it to us between farm A and B. There's this enormous delta. He invoked that rather nicely in his personal descriptions. So moving too quickly, let us adopt Derrida's vocabulary for a moment and return to the panel and the spectrum of views that I've kind of gestured at here, located between Kamhi and Spence. Much of the popular discourse would have us believe that the war, the real conflict, is between Kamhi and Spence, between vegetarian and omnivore. And this framing has enormous consequences for resource distribution and intergroup cooperation. If I had more time, I would really want to draw this out, the way this is not just some kind of ideological disagreement that we argue over in colleges, but it shapes the way vast resources are distributed in this country, which then shape policy. But in this moment, I think there is a more compelling and more productive reading. The war of which Derrida speaks is not today between the vegetarian and the meat eater. The war is between those who, quote, violate not only animal life, but even and also this sentiment of compassion, and on the other hand, those who appeal to an irrefutable testimony to this pity, an irrefutable testimony to this pity. I would argue that both Kamhi's argument that the pigness of the pig leaps over ethical questions and demands an inviolability in a religious register ultimately shares important ground with Spence's argument that a true farmer would find factory farming intolerable. My memory is correct, that word intolerable was the precise word. The language of intolerability is also a kind of launch into the sphere of the sacred. The intolerability of the factory farm is not the same as the inviolability of the pig. But nor are these sentiments necessarily at war in the always compromised world in which we actually live. Vegetarian or vegan and omnivore have real disagreements, real conflicts, conflicts that matter, and I do not wish at all for these conflicts to stop or even be reduced. If by conflict we mean debate and engagement with others who disagree, I am all for that conflict. The more of that conflict, the better. But is this conflict the war of which Derrida speaks? The war in which I think a Kamhi and a Spence are on the same side is not, if we are following Derrida, simply an ethical dispute, but something deeper. We might call it an ontological war, a war of religion. That is, I think Kamhi is right to say that the pig leaps over ethics to the realm of the sacred, to the ground from which ethics springs. Ground is one of the terms important for Derrida here. For Kamhi and many others, what happens at this ground, this foundation, demands the inviolability of the pig. For Spence and many more others, the pig can be killed but must be respected. These are different responses. But I submit both are occurring in this register of depth. Both are authentic responses to something that cannot ultimately be wholly accounted for in the language of ethics. And this something, this very ground of the ethical, is what the factory farm has violated. What is the authentic response to this ground where we encounter the pigness of pigs? The diverse views of the panel clearly express some important disagreements on the question of killing. And I can think of few more productive questions to raise in our classrooms, in our homes, in our professional lives, than whether at this moment we should be eating meat. But we cannot forget as we do this, that this important and ageist conflict between vegan and omnivore today takes place in the context of a larger war. And we cannot let ourselves or our nations forget this. The stakes are too high, the suffering too vast, the moment too urgent. Our context today demands seeing at least a political alliance. But, and this is the entire force of my remarks, I believe we have more than an expedient political alliance between the vegan and the omnivore. That is what made the diverse, conflicted voices of the panel resonate in my mind as symphonic rather than discordant. And at least, this is my bet, attentiveness to this shared religious or sacred call or dimension to defend not only animal lives, but compassion could go a long way towards ultimately ending the factory farm. Thank you.
Are we going to do 3 in a row and then questions? Okay. Thank you. So I'm now going to try and cover 3,000 years of history in 20 minutes. In August 2006, a Virginia senator named George Allen was in the midst of a controversial bid for re-election. His campaign, which would prove unsuccessful, was on its heels after several missteps, including his reported ownership of stock in a company that sold the morning after pill, a problematic investment for a candidate running on the Republican ticket in the South, and his use of a racial slur. Later that same month, another potential scandal came to light, namely the fact that his mother might have Jewish lineage. According to the matrilineal principle of Jewish law, Jewish identity is imparted by one's biological mother. If your biological mother is Jewish, then you are Jewish. Though a member of the Presbyterian Church, Allen now had to explain this revelation about his religious and ethnic identity to his constituency. Almost a month later, the New York Times reported the following exchange, quote, "I still had a ham sandwich for lunch," Mr. Allen told the Richmond Times-Dispatch, referring to rules against eating pork, "and my mother made great pork chops," end quote. In denying the relevance of his distant Jewish past, one that he had only learned about a couple of days earlier before uttering these words, Allen turned to the food on his plate, and one food in particular, the pig. It is telling that he also highlighted his mother's culinary prowess with regard to pork chops. Since it was her lineage that he wished to complicate, he clearly used pig to problematize and marginalize her Jewish identity. After all, how Jewish could his mother be if she made great pork chops? Though Allen was probably not aware of it, he was engaging in a millennia-old practice of utilizing pig to locate self and other on an identity map, as either inside or outside the territory marked as Jewish. In this common historical trope, the pig functions as a semiotic sign invested with much signification. I therefore use Allen's scandal to introduce this process, which I will playfully refer to as the swine and the signified. So this trope has its origins in the biblical book of Leviticus. Leviticus 11, attributed to the priestly or P source, addresses the dietary laws concerning 5 categories of animals. Within the first 4 categories, subsets of animals are either permitted or tabooed. The 5th category, which is small land animals, which we learned about their domestication earlier, is completely prohibited. In discussing the first category of animals, or quadrupeds, a criterion for ingestion is provided. Only those quadrupeds that have split hooves and chew the cud can be eaten. Leviticus 11:4-7 then enumerates 4 animals that it deems to have one, but not both, of the criteria. The camel, the rock badger, and the hare chew the cud, but do not have split hooves. And the pig has split hoofs, but does not chew the cud. Leviticus neither offers a justification for this taboo, nor singles out the pig. From the seemingly humble origin, the culinary regulation concerning the pig in Leviticus 11:7 will take on a life of its own, and eventually be viewed as perhaps the most well-known biblical taboo. It is in the Second Temple period, from roughly 515 BCE to 70 CE, that the pig begins to emerge as a particularly important meat vis-a-vis Jewish identity. Both Jewish and non-Jewish sources from this era devote more time to discussing the pig than to any other biblically forbidden quadruped. The reason why the pig is placed front and center in these texts remains unclear. Was the pig abhorred more than any other non-kosher beast at the time? Or was pig simply the most commonly encountered non-kosher quadruped for inhabitants of Roman Palestine? We simply do not know. Regardless, the absence of the pig from the Jewish menu proved worthy of note for both Jewish and non-Jewish authors in the ancient world. In discussing Judaism, ancient Greek and Roman authors ponder why Jews engage in three practices: Sabbath observance, circumcision, and abstention from pork. What Jews did and did not eat, therefore, serves as a mechanism for exploring Jewish difference. In their examinations of this dietary difference, ancient non-Jewish authors often simply make casual reference to or provide ethnographic explanations for this peculiar culinary behavior. For the Latin satirists, the Jewish pork taboo is a vehicle for humor. As the late Cristiano Grattanelli aptly observes, quote, "An ancient and consistent series of porcine topoi was used by Greek and Roman authors to answer the difficult question, what is the identity of the Jews, by answering the apparently more specific and thus seemingly easier question, why do Jews avoid eating pork?" End quote. In this sense, pork truly is the other white meat. And I should quickly add as an aside, almost a decade ago, I gave my first paper on pork at Yale at a grad conference, and it was called The Other White Meat, so that's a callback. The most fascinating pork-related interactions between Jews and non-Jews are found in ancient Jewish sources. For example, 2nd and 4th Maccabees each contain two complex accounts of pork-related Jewish martyrdom at the hands of Antiochus, the villain of the Hanukkah story. The first concerning an old man named Eliezer, and the second details that of a mother and her 7 sons. All 9 of these characters are offered the opportunity to eat pork rather than die, and all choose martyrdom over meat. While these accounts are literary, that does not mean that we cannot glean historical information from them. What we learn from these narratives is that pig represented otherness. To eat pork was an act of identification. Concomitantly, to renounce pork was to engage in a practice of identification as well. One's relationship with pork, therefore, was, and remains unto today, fraught with symbolic association. And it was during this time period when that particular connection began. The Second Temple period comes to an end in 70 CE, when the Second Temple was destroyed at the hands of Rome. It is worth noting that the Roman legion that accomplished this task was the Legio Tenfretensis, whose symbol was the boar. At the time, Judaism was a temple-based religion, so the disappearance of this central cultic site was nothing short of a theological, economic, and social catastrophe. The rabbis, the group of ancient Jews to whom I devote the majority of my scholarly inquiry, sought to fill the vacuum created in the wake of this loss. As I've written elsewhere, the rabbis associated Rome with the pig. Like the pig, Rome appeared kosher on the outside, which belied its internal corruption. Further, rabbinic remembrances of the Second Temple, of the destruction of the Second Temple, often describe the use of pig as a weapon deployed by Rome, or the pig, in order to physically and symbolically conquer Jerusalem. The rabbis thus inherited and expanded the tradition of swine and signified, wherein the pig is a semiotic sign invested with signification of otherness. One fascinating tale, which I couldn't resist talking about in this connection, plays a central role as a potential menage a trois between 2 very beautiful Roman women and the renowned Rabbi Akiva. Visiting Rome, the great Rabbi Akiva is slandered, i.e. it is falsely reported that he enjoys, in the company of one commentator, the company of loose women. Hearing this, a Roman general sends 2 beautiful and all gussied up ladies to Rabbi Akiva's bedroom, where they anticipate an evening of pleasure and fornication. Alas, Rabbi Akiva proves unwilling to engage in what appears to be both an ancient and modern male fantasy. Rabbi Akiva's refusal is part of a rabbinic trope of self-restraint, a societal ideal influenced by contemporaneous Greek and Roman philosophy, extolling self-control and self-mastery. What is interesting for the discussion at hand is a pun contained in the beautiful women's solicitation of Rabbi Akiva. Each says to him, "Turn towards me," in Hebrew, chazor etzli. The Hebrew root for the word turn, chazar, is morphologically similar to the word for pig, or chazir. Only one vowel sound distinguishes them. The women's words reinforce the scent that Rabbi Akiva attributes to them, that of pig meat. This association between Roman women and pig is not random. Rather, it is part of a long tradition in which pig serves as a metonym for Rome, Romans, and Romanness. Thus, when Rabbi Akiva remarks that these non-Jewish women smell of various non-kosher foods, it is quite important that pig appears on this list. It has become the non-kosher beast par excellence due to its association with Roman identity. The very words that these very beautiful women use to try and seduce him are reminders of their non-Jewish or treif and non-kosher identity. One can actually use an American English vulgarism for coitus to render this term exactly how it sounded to Rabbi Akiva's ears. Instead of saying, "Turn towards me," Rabbi Akiva heard each woman imploring him, "Pork me." Over the ensuing centuries, Jews continued to view pork consumption as a practice of non-Jewish identity formation. For example, while Jews are allowed to hire non-Jews as wet nurses for their children, and while young Jewish children are permitted to eat non-kosher food, one 13th century rabbi cautions, quote, "One should warn the non-Jewish wet nurse not to eat impure foods or pork, and certainly not to feed the infants impure substances. For everything that a woman eats, the infant eats," end quote. While pork is clearly an impure food, it is singled out here to symbolize both the diet of the non-Jew and the potential threat it, and by extension the non-Jew herself, presents to a Jewish infant suckling from her bosom. But Jews were not the only ones promulgating this association. Non-Jews increasingly turned to the pig to demarcate Jewish identity. No less a literary master than William Shakespeare plays with this motif when in The Merchant of Venice, Bassanio invites the complicated Jewish character Shylock to dinner. In response to this invitation, Shylock replies, quote, "Yes, to smell pork, to eat of the habitation which your prophet the Nazarite conjured the devil into. I will buy with you, sell with you, talk with you, walk with you, and so following. But I will not eat with you, drink with you, nor pray with you," end quote. As David Goldstein asks, quote, "Why is the first thing that we learn about Shylock, besides the fact that he practices usury, that he doesn't eat pigs? Because, as Goldstein concludes, pork functions both in the play and in the so-called Judeo-Christian religious imaginary as a metonym for the difference between Christian and Jewish commensality. Pork in The Merchant acts almost as iodine does in a CAT scan, throwing the interconnections and blockages of the play's body into relief," end quote. It is telling that the pig is the symbol of this dividing line, as it represents both the fault line down the table and the identity of those who partake and abstain from its flesh. Sometimes the association between Jewish identity and pork plays out in seemingly contradictory ways. A fascinating example of this appears in the wake of the event that, according to the renowned historians Monty Python, nobody expects, the Spanish Inquisition. Faced with expulsion, death, or conversion, some Jews fled, some were martyred, and some converted. Amongst the latter group, the conversos, many converted in name only, and then continued to practice Judaism in secret. This was referenced yesterday. Such people are often referred to as crypto-Jews and were the subject of much consternation since they were seen to mock the system. One pejorative term for crypto-Jews was Marranos. Etymologically, Marrano comes from the Arabic maharam, meaning the thing that is forbidden. As Claudine Fabre-Vassas notes, quote, "This demonstration shows the filiation. An ethnologist should not be surprised that the forbidden animal should be named by the word signifying the interdiction itself," end quote. Once again, the swine functions as a sign. Despite its Arabic roots and the obvious connection with Islam, after all, the pig is the only categorically tabooed animal in the Quran, the term Marrano refers to Jewish converts to Catholicism who continue to practice Judaism in secret. They are pigs. Just as ancient rabbis accused Rome of masquerading like the pig, whose external kosher appearance cloaks its internal non-kosher corruption, here Iberian Catholics accuse crypto-Jews of hiding behind a porcine mask. While they may play the role of the non-Jew, the pig in public, they remain corrupt. Hence, they are called pigs. Christians in particular seized on this pig as symbol of non-Jewishness, and therefore associated one who abstained from pork with non-Christian behavior, often referred to as Judaizing. This understanding informs an 18th century song from Burgundy, which claims that, quote, "While the Jewish law prohibits lard as heretical, the same is not so in Christian lands. Let us eat fresh pork, let us eat. The more we enjoy the piglet, the better Catholics we become," end quote. The more one eats pork, the more one demonstrates their Christian piety. Leaving pork off one's plate, after all, is a very Jewish thing to do. Even progressive Jews who eschewed traditional kosher laws found the practice of pork consumption problematic. A notable example of this phenomenon occurred on July 11, 1883, when the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, hosted a banquet to celebrate the ordination of the college's first class of Reform rabbis. The menu for this gourmet feast, later infamously known as the treifa or non-kosher banquet, included 4 biblically forbidden foods: clams, crabs, shrimp, and frogs, for those counting at home, and violated other rabbinic dietary regulations by serving non-kosher meat and mixing milk and meat. Over a series of elaborate courses, the diners who partook of this feast, and those who stormed out, each made a statement about Reform Judaism's stance on the traditional Jewish dietary laws, and by extension, on its theology in general. The intra- and interdenominational consternation, inspired in part by the treifa banquet, contributed to the bifurcation of American Judaism still evidenced today. Lost in the haze of those who did and did not eat the clams, crabs, shrimp, and frogs was the fact that this transgressive meal did not violate one particular biblical taboo. Pork never appeared on the menu. Since this banquet was served in Cincinnati, a city nicknamed Porkopolis, this absence is worthy of note. Though 2 years later the Reform movement would adopt the Pittsburgh platform that rejected, quote, all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws that regulate diet, end quote, Reform Judaism initially did not violate this particular dietary prohibition. In fact, initial discussion about Reform Judaism's stance on non-kosher food in America centered around 2 foods, pork and oysters, with the resulting general opinion that pork was prohibited, but oysters were permitted. As a sea creature with neither fins nor scales, oysters are not kosher. They were, however, tasty, affordable, popular, considered healthy, and as an added bonus, an aphrodisiac. These factors led Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, founder of the Hebrew Union College, to refer to oysters as ocean vegetables, to argue that, quote, there can be no doubt that the oyster shell is the same to all intents and purposes as the scales and fins on clean fish, protecting against certain gases in the water, and thus, end quote, and thus to permit their ingestion. No such interpretation occurred for pork. It was within this, what one scholar called no pork, yes oyster viewpoint, that we discern the legacy of more than 2 millennia of historical baggage. And even when this baggage seems safely stowed away, it emerges from storage to reassert itself. Such is the role that pork plays in the popularity of Chinese food amongst American Jews. In a famous essay originally published in 1992, sociologists Tuckman and Levine suggest several reasons, in the words of Jennifer Eight Lee, why chow mein is the chosen food of the chosen people. One of the primary reasons for this association is the fact that though pork, shellfish, and other biblically prohibited foodstuffs are staples of Chinese cooking, these tabooed ingredients are disguised via common Chinese cooking techniques in which the forbidden animal proteins are cut, chopped, and minced. A Jewish patron might be willing to eat a pile of unrecognizable chopped white meat in a sea of salty noodles, but might not eat a pork chop. The latter is unambiguously treif or non-kosher, while the former is a meat of unknown origin. Tantamount to a culinary don't ask, don't tell policy, Tuckman and Levine labeled this principle of misrecognition safe treif. It allowed American Jews to transgress without feeling transgressive. I have 2 minutes left, but I might have to go a minute over, I apologize. The connection between pork and Jewish identity is so common that it appears even when an alternative interpretation of the porcine data seems more likely. For example, in the 1994 Quentin Tarantino film Pulp Fiction, the following exchange occurred between 2 fellow contract killers. Vincent, want some bacon? Jules, no man, I don't eat pork. Vincent, are you Jewish? Jules, nah, I ain't Jewish, I just don't dig on the swine, that's all. Vincent, why not? Jules, pigs are filthy animals. I don't eat filthy animals. Vincent, bacon tastes good. Pork chops taste good. End quote. I'm not an actor, so I'll apologize. When Vincent, played by the Caucasian actor John Travolta, discovers that Jules, played by the African-American actor Samuel L. Jackson, refrains from ingesting pork, he immediately inquires whether Jules is Jewish. As an African-American, Jules is more likely to be a Muslim than a Jew. Since both Muslims and Jews do not eat pork, we need to ask why Vincent suspects that Jules' dietary practice derives from his adherence to Judaism and not Islam. Perhaps Jules' penchant for quoting Ezekiel 25:17, a pseudo-biblical passage, prior to executing someone influenced Vincent's question. However, I would argue that it is not only because it adds a small layer of humor to imagine the African-American assassin Jules as a Jew, but because of the historical association between pork and Jewish identity. Muslims may not eat pork, but it is historically more common to presume that a patron who profanes pork is a Jew. A coda to this paper that is going to make me a minute over recently presented itself when another Republican politician from the South used pork to discuss Jewish identity. In an interview on February 1st, 2015 with CNN, former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee remarked in regard to his views on gay marriage, quote, "It's like asking somebody who's Jewish to start serving bacon-wrapped shrimp in their deli. We don't do that. I mean, we're not going to do that. Or asking a Muslim to serve up something that is offensive to him, or to have dogs in his backyard," end quote. Once again, the Muslim pork taboo is either minimized or ignored. But Huckabee's example of bacon-wrapped shrimp as representing Christian attitudes towards gay sexuality and marriage indicates that the pork taboo is a central component of Jewish identity. Forcing Jews to serve such a product in their delis, a quintessential American Jewish dining establishment, is tantamount, in Huckabee's opinion, to forcing Christian business owners to accept marriage equality. Serving and concomitantly eating pork functions as a synecdoche for forced violation of Jewish practices. Gay marriage proponents are therefore cast in the role of Antiochus, the villain of the Hanukkah story mentioned earlier, who forced Jews to eat pork. In this metaphor, Huckabee's Christians are the Jewish martyrs who chose death rather than consuming pork. Once again, pork indexes Jewish identity, only now it would seem a Christian who engages in Judaizing behavior, who eschews pork, is a good Christian. Pork continues to play an important role in talking about Jews, Judaism, Jewish identity, and the rhetoric, beliefs, and practices of others in relation to Jews, Judaism, and Jewish identity. If history has taught us anything, it is that we should expect the presence or absence of pork from one's diet to be laden with meaning for years to come. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Yoskowitz. I am a writer. I am a owner of a gefilte fish business. What am I doing here talking about pork? It's been the big question. I've spent many years writing about the pork industry in Israel, and also writing about the Jewish relationship and the connection to pigs. That brought me to Israel a number of years ago, where I started my research. I actually moved on to an Israeli pig farm, spent time researching the topic, speaking with Israelis, and I came to see that the pork taboo that Jordan was speaking about, usually I have to spend a lot of time talking about the taboo and all of the associations and the history and the challenges, but I'm so glad you went first, so I don't have to focus on that. But the taboo plays itself out in a really interesting way, and you start to see that as the founding of the State of Israel, you actually have almost a consensus, a general feeling that this pork taboo is relevant and culturally a part of the Israeli cultural life. And today, you start to see that that taboo has eroded, and actually the pig has started to symbolize something new within Israeli society, a new secular identity, a new marker of identity. So that's what I want to talk about today, and while looking at the Israeli pork industry, a little overview. I moved to Tel Aviv in 2007 to begin my research on a fellowship from Brown University, and about 2 days after I arrived, there was an arson attack against a shop selling pork, Ma'aneh Aviv. This is in the city of Tzfat, one of the holy cities. Suspected arsonist was a ultra-Orthodox Israeli. I was pretty shocked that there was a pork shop being burned. Apparently this happens quite often. While I was living in Tel Aviv for 1 year, there were 3 pork shops that were attacked. There was a film in 2005 called The Schwartz Dynasty, which actually shows the firebombing of a Russian establishment selling pork in Israel. So this is quite common, and I always think it's interesting to think about what it would look like, or what it would smell like. The smell of pig flesh cooking, because of this fire. But this is just to go to show you how tense this issue is in this country. The founding of the Jewish state, the founding of Israel in 1948, it came with a conversation about what would the character of the state be? What would the Jewish identity look like? And there were debates. Early Zionists, even before the founding of the State of Israel, were really, trying to make the case that, no, we're building a new Jewish identity. We need to distance ourselves from the past of the diaspora, the humiliation of those associations related to pork. But yet, the general consensus was that it was too important to ignore this symbol of otherness, this symbol that has kept us from European civilization, from assimilation for all these years. This is a quote from Natan Alterman, a Zionist, a poet, during these debates in the Knesset, debating whether or not that pork should be even allowed in Israel. And this is in the 1950s, so after the founding of the state. He writes, "Memories of revulsion etched in by sword and whip are now engraved as an unconscious instinct. Even those unable to discern a cloven-hoofed one from one that is not will sense this. When a Jewish nation in Israel makes the pig a sine qua non, its history shudders." This making the case that we really can't have pork in this country. But you're also trying to build a democratic society and trying to be an open civilization. What ended up happening was overwhelming consensus in the Israeli Knesset was to ban pigs. In 1956, the first law was passed that allowed different municipalities in Israel to ban the breeding and sale of pigs. And Tel Aviv, the secular Israeli city, was one of the first to ban these pigs. And in 1962, a second law was passed that actually made it illegal nationwide to raise pigs, and also made it illegal to sell pigs, except in regions that were Christian Arab in Israel. There are 9 specific regions that were specifically demarcated. Iblin, Nazareth, and Ma'ilya were among 3 of those. So it's really interesting. A lot of Israeli pig farmers at that time, and there were some, I'm going to talk about them in a moment, but they all moved their pigs onto the Arab lands and started partnering with Arabs in pig production in Israel. But so what ended up happening was is it became illegal, but there were exemptions, and pigs continued to be raised. Pigs were always raised in Israel. The British period, the Ottoman period, you always had various populations that were breeding these animals, and suddenly it was banned. And the laws, there's an incredible, these debates and the laws are actually chronicled quite well in the book Outlawed Pigs by the legal historian and now Supreme Court Justice Daphna Barak Erez, and I highly recommend the book. But this is really a fight for the soul of the country. What you'll see is that the secular Israelis and the religious Zionists, this relationship and support of banning pigs is something that will erode over time. So in the early years of the State of Israel, the 1950s, this period known as the Tzena, the years of austerity, this is a period of intense food rations, so much hunger, and a lot of these kibbutznikim, these are chalutzim, people settling the land. This is a kibbutz in the north of Israel, and they were just trying to figure out how to survive. There were all these jokes the kibbutz is a socialist, agricultural collective that was part of the founding culture of the State of Israel. And there were all these jokes making fun of the hunger. When would you eat a chicken? A kibbutznik would only eat a chicken when either he was about to die or the chicken was about to die. And how does a kibbutznik eat margarine? You slice it in 16ths. Not the funniest jokes, but but jokes nonetheless. But I like that. I spent time on a lot of different kibbutzim. I lived on kibbutz Lahav, a pig farm in the south, which I'll talk about in a moment. I met with a lot of different kibbutz elders, and I found that a lot of these secular kibbutzim had what I like to call their pork origin stories, which is how they first got their pigs in the 1950s. Kibbutz Mizra, one of my kind of the most. If you talk to any Israeli about pork in Israel, they'll say, "Oh, Kibbutz Mizra, like, this is the institution." Kibbutz Mizra, their story goes that one kibbutznik one day showed up and he had a pregnant sow, and he brought her and he put her into the cow refet, the little cow pasture area, and put her in the corner. They named the pig. They named her Lo Klum, which means nothing. And so whenever the inspectors would come to inspect the dairy operation in Israel to see if it was kosher, they would ask, "What's over there?" They'd say, "Oh, Lo Klum, it's nothing." But then she gave birth, and they were just feeding food scraps. They were just feeding their rinds and their peels, and they fattened her up. And they had these 10 piglets, and they were fattening them up. And suddenly, these people who were only eating meat around Passover and Yom Kippur were suddenly eating meat frequently, and they were having protein, and it was helping them build their kibbutz and this vision of a country. And it ended up becoming an important part of that kibbutz. And there were multiple stories, so many different kibbutzim. One story was another kibbutz nearby brought a pig on Yom Kippur so the religious kibbutz nearby wouldn't see them. And the story goes that the pig got out of the truck and ended up going into the synagogue during Kol Nidre. And it might be apocryphal, who knows, it's a great story. But the idea of these kibbutzim, these pigs were providing them sustenance and ended up becoming a really important part of their survival. So this symbol of humiliation and oppression ended up becoming a savior of sorts. And so that's really important to keep in mind. This is Kibbutz Mizra. These are archival photos of their early pig operations. Kibbutz Mizra was one of the few kibbutzim that really built a plant, a processing plant. And in 1962, when it was illegal to raise pigs, they were obviously not in a Christian Arab region of Israel. They moved their pigs, but they kept the plant. And the plant is now the largest non-kosher processing plant in Israel of non-kosher meat. This plant was very inspiring for a lot of secular kibbutznikim. When I went to fly to Israel to begin this research, the security guard, if you ever fly to Israel, they grill you and interrogate you. And I went there and he asked me what I was doing, and I said I was going to research the pork industry. And the first question, he said to me, "Oh, you mean like Kibbutz Mizra?" I said, "Yeah." And he's just like, "I love their meat." I walked right through. So it was important. And this is Chibi Tzvi Harel, one of the Kibbutz Mizra elders and a resident historian. I met with him and spoke with him a lot about the history of the kibbutz. And he would just talk he couldn't tell you how much it meant that they were raising the best quality meat in Israel. It was so important. The kibbutz ended up selling its stake in the processing plant in the mid-2000s because of other financial issues. But at one point, Kibbutz Mizra, 40% of its revenue was coming from pigs. So they built and they were one of the successful kibbutzim in Israel. They built their success on the back of hogs. And he recognized that. At the same time, Chibi was he wasn't very hopeful. This is a photo from 1989. This was a protest that he was part of leading. Various different pig growers and the secular kibbutznikim. They were fighting what was called Chok Chazir, a proposed law that would completely ban all pig farming in Israel and the sale of pigs. Over the years, from 1962 up until 1989, as there was a rift between secular Israel and religious Israel, there was an attempt by a really empowered religious minority in government that has a lot of outsized influence to essentially get rid of these pigs, this not just an eyesore, but this symbol of this anti-Jewishness, this un-Jewish meat. And this was a protest, and you can see there's there's this fear among some of these secular Israelis. I had met a neighbor of a man named Mark Eisenberg, a neighbor of Kibbutz Mizra, who said that the minute Mizra closes, he's leaving Israel. It's a litmus test for democracy. The minute it closes, Israel's become a theocracy. And so this fight is one that really emboldened Israeli pig farmers in Israel and secular Israelis who themselves loved pork. It emboldened them and made them really appreciate that this was something they were fighting these religious forces in government and expressing themselves as secular Jews in Israel. And I should note that there still is the taboo is still very much alive, and most Israelis don't refer to pork in Hebrew by its name chazir, but instead they use a series of euphemisms: steak levan, white steak; basar levan, white meat. My favorite is para nemucha, which is a short cow. But this is no joke. This is how it is referred to. Jordan writes about the idea of devar acher. Talmudic rabbis, they wouldn't actually call pigs by their name in the Talmud. They'd actually refer to them as the other thing. In some ways, this is a long line tradition. But even those who eat pork won't call it chazir. And to me, that was just, it shows that even as much as you can reject this idea of abstaining from pork, you can still sort of internalize it. This is Kibbutz Lahav, where I actually lived for 2 months and worked in pig insemination. I was promoted to pig insemination once I was on dead pig cleanup, and I was injecting antibiotics. This is an industrial pig farm. It was a miserable place. Everything that was being talked about yesterday, I was feeling really intensely. It should be noted that the two men in the picture on the left is Marcos, a Jewish Argentine who does not eat pork. And on the right is Imat, a Palestinian Muslim who does not eat pork. The people who run the pig farm on Kibbutz Lahav do not eat pork. Yet, this is a kibbutz in the south of the country. In 1962, when the law passed to ban pig breeding, and this is a region not in one of the Christian Arab parts of the country, but the lawyers of Kibbutz Lahav quickly suggested that they open up a scientific research institute and get an exemption for raising pigs for science. So this kibbutz essentially raises pigs for science and slaughters the excess, and it was kind of a national wink-wink. Although in the 90s, because of the biotech boom, this actually became quite an important, pigs started being used for all sorts of important experiments in Israel, but up until the 90s, it was really just a front. Kibbutz Lahav opened up a shop on its premises along the highway for people to buy pork, and Israelis would come from all over the country to drive down to the Negev to buy pork. It became an important rite. I had met a number of Israelis for whom that was their Saturday ritual. On Shabbat would be to drive down to buy pork from Kibbutz Lahav. This is me just posing in front of the pig carcasses. In the 1990s, 1 million Russian immigrants from the former Soviet Union flooded into Israel. About 1/6 of Israel's population. Many of them exercised the law of return. They have Jewish roots. One Jewish grandparent was all that was necessary. They brought with them a taste for pork, many of whom had very little religious connection to Judaism. And this is a picture of Tivtam, which was up until recently the fastest growing supermarket in Israel, and now is just an establishment supermarket in Israel that started as a pork shop selling pork in the Carmel market in Tel Aviv. So this industry, because it was illegal to sell pork for so long, it became a black market industry until the 1990s, when a law was passed that essentially overrided the law preventing you from selling pork. So it became legal to sell pork, and this small pork shop that essentially catered to Russian tastes ended up becoming a gourmet specialty food market in Israel that is associated now with secular Israel. It's open on the Sabbath. It was the first supermarket to reject Sabbath observance. And I had met a number of Israelis who only shopped there to support them. And it should be noted that in 2007, when Russian billionaire and oligarch Arkady Gaidamak was running for mayor of Jerusalem, he wanted to win religious support. So he tried to buy Tivtam, which had become the symbol of secular Israel, to make it kosher. He wanted to remove pigs. He actually didn't understand that it was more than just removing the pigs, the pork, to make it kosher. And he also didn't realize that the only customers were there because they sell pork and are not kosher. But that ended up falling through. But that was an attempt for him to win religious support, because this has become such a divisive issue. And as this secular identity has grown and expressed itself, you also have the rejection of it. You saw the arson attacks early on. You have a polarization happening, and the pork industry is a great representation of that. This is Eli Landau. He's a food writer in Israel. I had written an article about him when he wrote the first Hebrew language pork cookbook in 2010, 81 recipes, all of pork, Middle Eastern recipes. And he felt like Israel, he wrote this book and he said that Israel was finally ready. He had hoped to embrace the pig. We can finally move beyond this taboo that's held us back. And he said, if only people knew how to cook pork well, because Israelis don't know how to cook it or butcher it, he said, then maybe we can see the embrace of it. And he put out this book. He actually couldn't find a publisher for the book, so he self-published it. And he sold very few copies. And it was, for him, really distressing. He actually died just a few months after I had met with him. That was about 9 months after the book, and he was heartbroken that he was unsuccessful that Israel wasn't quite there yet with him. For him, as an Israeli food writer, he was one of the foremost food writers in Israel. This was an expression of his culinary identity as a writer. It's like he learned about food in Italy. He traveled. He said, finally, we can open up to the world. And the country wasn't quite there with him, although he was admired by many in the culinary field. And last, I just want to end with Chef Meir Adoni. He's a very well-known chef in Israel. He had a restaurant, Katit. I had spoken with him back in 2011, and he told me that while his mother was alive, he would never put pork on the menu. And deference to her, she was from North African in origin. It would just be so awful for her to go to a restaurant that he runs and see pork on the menu. And about 2 years after that, he opened a new restaurant, Mizlala, and on his menu, written not in euphemism, not in Lavan, what was written was beten chazir, pork belly. So within 2 years, his mother did not die, but it was hard to be in the fine dining space in Tel Aviv, to have a kind of a fancy restaurant and not have pork on the menu. It's become an expectation. And so what you see is because of the laws, the anti-pig breeding laws, the laws that banned the selling of pork up until the early 90s, you see the black market nature of it. It made it something that was very alluring. So a lot of the people in the food world, a lot of writers and chefs all talk about the first time they tasted the transgressive taste of steak levan. The first food trend in Israel in the 70s was steak in a pita, and you'd go and you'd ask for the white steak. And so they all have that memory of discovering the joy and the pleasure of food, which in a socialist country like Israel was actually, the pleasure of food itself was actually was transgressive as well, taking pleasure in it. And what's interesting for me is that the taste, the taboo, it's still there. It's still something everyone's wrestling with in Israel, but the symbolism of the pig has changed for secular Israelis, and it's become a symbol of almost liberation and freedom, both from religion and from this past, and also this Orthodox tradition within the culture. And thank you so much.
Thank you to all our three speakers and for very fascinating papers. Yes, I would like to invite questions and comments. Who's starting again?
Okay. It's really, really interesting, and across all three papers, such continuity. And so I guess this question is for all three of you. But it starts with noting the point that Jordan was bringing up about, in particular, crypto-Jews. And I'm not going to say the word correctly, so I'm not going to try to. But the naming of Jews as pigs, which I find really fascinating, this notion that on the one hand, the pig names the thing that they cannot eat, and yet for Gentiles, the pigs are themselves Jews. And I was reminded of Richard Walter Dere, who is the Nazi Minister of Agriculture, who writes a book called The Pig as a Criterion for Nordic People and Semites, sometime I think in the mid-1930s, possibly into the late 1930s. And it begins with the line, Jews are the pork of humans. And pork here specifically, they're not the pigs of humans, but that they are the pork. They are the Schweinefleisch, or whatever. I'm trying to remember the exact German for it. But what are we to make of that constant sort of recurring trope that like the process of identification here is both in naming the thing that the Jews will not eat, and yet in not eating it, they become it. That might be one of the ways of talking about it. Certainly, that was Dare's sort of perspective on it.
So actually, my way of answering, oddly, my first thought in answering that is to think of zombies, because the idea being this, because zombies are a way that's becoming popular in culture too, as a way of thinking through humanness and what it means to be human, and what it means to not be human, right? And I think pig is because there are all this complicated, interesting back and forth with humans and pigs, and the humanist or pigness of pigs and things. I think pigs are often used to think about humanness as well, and to reflect on that. And I think with the Marano thing, you're seeing as different groups have used pig to identify what groups one belongs to, how far one is outside of it. And what I was getting at with that Marano thing is you start to then see an interesting complication where pig is sometimes, it's not just used to discuss is one Jewish or non-Jewish, but even how in some ways it gets flipped on its head. But on one hand, it's getting flipped on its head, but in that flipping of it, you're seeing how pig really is becoming indexing of other, and it's zooming out. And so calling a Jew a pig, on the one hand, it makes no sense. On the other hand, makes actual tremendous sense if you think of the symbolic nature of it. So that's why. So I think that what that's showing, and then you could continue on to the example you're giving. It's thinking about how pig can be used and that relationship with pig to talk about how one understands the nature of a person, in this particular Jew, and how human or inhuman they are.
A few things come to mind. You had mentioned Claudine Fabre-Vassas, her work, The Singular Beast, and she talks about the blood libel and the origins of the blood libel, in that this idea that Jews themselves were not, they weren't eating pigs, which meant that they had to be pigs themselves, and the idea that they would, that's why they would be wanting to eat the blood of these Gentile children and putting them in matzah. I mean, not the best, doesn't make the most sense, but that's this idea. But the other thing that came to my mind is also the self-identification that some of the Talmudic rabbis had with, not Talmudic rabbis, sorry, the Kabbalistic rabbis had with the pigs. Pigs, as in the Shulchan Aruch, it actually says that if a pig, if there's a pestilence among pigs, then it's the duty for a rabbi to call for a public fast. And there's this idea that these rabbis had a sense that there was a similar anatomy, there was a similar enough relationship that humans could get sick from pigs. This is the only animal that the rabbis call for calling a public fast for. This is what you would do for a mourning ritual. And so, to me, it was almost an acknowledgement. Maybe we are like these pigs. I always appreciate that from the rabbis.
My comment and question is directed to Jeffrey. First of all, the story you told must be incredibly disappointing to some evangelical Christians in the United States, because some of them have actually, from what I understand, taken on the pig prohibition as part of their own identity. And they're looking into a Christian Zionist tradition that they're reinterpreting. So it's a very fascinating story. My question is about whether the divide is simply one between religious and secular in Israel, or are you, perhaps the time didn't allow it, glossing over a divide maybe between the Ashkenazis and the Mizrahis in particular? I'm thinking of the question of assimilation to a, quote, secular or Western culture, that might arise much more importantly or prominently in an Ashkenazi tradition versus a Mizrahi tradition, where the issue of pig, consumption would not have come up. And in that sense, I'm also curious whether there's what we see is also wanting to assimilate into a Western narrative, but also to reject the Middle Eastern culture that surrounds Israeli, one that is now Islamic and very much rejecting the pig and wanting to almost pull away and disassociate by adopting this more modern secular discourse of pig consumption. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an interesting question. So I definitely did have to not talk as much about also the issues with Russian Israelis coming in. I wouldn't say it's a Sephardic Ashkenazi difference. I do think it is very much secular and religious, but there is among Sephardic or Mizrahi Jews of Eastern origin, Middle Eastern origin. I have some relatives of Middle Eastern origin. There is a more traditionalism, generally speaking, and we're speaking in general terms, that I remember when I was working on the pig farm, I went to visit my cousins whose parents my family's Polish, but they all married Iraqi men for some reason in Israel. And I was told, don't discuss that you're working on a pig farm, among the grandparents from Iraq, and don't talk about it. It doesn't matter. I don't eat pork. I've never eaten it. I didn't even eat pork while on the pig farm. And just don't even mention it. Say you're on say that you're on a goat farm. And there was a fear because of this traditionalism that's there. But the secular Israeli identity, as I would come to understand it, and as it's been articulated, is very much in the Western European tradition. It's, and you see, I feel like, as more conservative traditional Israelis, as they modernize and westernize, as they become more secular, they're becoming more Western, and so that I'm not sure if I can articulate it in that way, but that's what I would say. I wouldn't say it's an Ashkenazi Sephardic thing at all, although I would say you would see a higher percentage among of non-Orthodox Sephardim of people keeping the pork prohibition.
I wanted to introduce the theme or the association between pigs and greed, and the capitalist pig. And I'm generally kind of curious as to where this association comes from, but I wonder whether there's also possibly a religious dimension to this as well, and a link to a kind of, well, on one side, the pleasure of eating pork flesh and the gorging on pork, and on the other hand, the kind of the element in a lot of religions of asceticism and self-denial and refusing some of the pleasures of the flesh. And I just wondered if anyone wanted to comment on that.
Actually, a lot of that comes from the real popularity comes from early Christian writers, but also some Second Temple Jewish writers who are trying to rationalize philosophically these biblical taboos. But then particularly you get this with early Christian writers who are trying to say that one should, that the biblical laws are metaphors and allegories particularly. So you should you can eat the animal, but you can't act like the animal. So a pig is greedy. They also say vultures and eagles, they snatch and they grab. So as long as you're not thieving, you can eat a pig. Or a lot of people will say, the biblical taboo against about fish, right, is they have to have fins and scales, and it's against bottom feeders. But actually the first reference that I could ever find to understanding it as bottom feeders is a first century CE Christian text, Epistle of Barnabas, which talks about how, it's because then those shellfish are down in the muck and mire of the dirt, and you can't be like that. You have to elevate yourself spiritually. So you can eat the oyster, but you just can't act like it. You can eat, and then I think that gets picked up on with other cultural associations. So that's my my intuition of it.
Thank you, all three of you, for those really great papers. And this is mostly to Jeffrey, I guess, but also to Jordan. And I'm thinking about in the contemporary period, and thinking about Islam and sort of a perceived other, and particularly sort of a dangerous hidden other, also in the way that Jews have been considered, especially in Europe. And I was thinking about a news story this week or last week about a Palestinian man who had been killed in territories, I think, and where an Israeli settler had intentionally defiled his body by throwing pork at it. I saw that. And I think several years ago there was some attempt at talking about pork bomb-sniffing pigs. Yeah. Similarly, with sort of this Israeli idea of Muslims really don't like pigs, so let's offend them in that way. So
I'll go first. I'll say, one thing that's interesting is these. In Israel, most of the pigs are being raised in the north in the Christian Arab region, but there's a lot of Christian Arab. A lot of Christian Arabs are leaving and they're going to different places, or they're leaving those regions, and now they're majority Muslim. And when you go to some of these towns, Ibn Ma'ilya, all you smell is the refuse of these pigs from these huge industrial farms, and it's an interesting real tension. What's going to be does the Israeli pork industry rely on the Muslim population, in Israel, and what does that mean? And it's really confusing. One of the jokes in Israel, again, not a good joke. I'm going to preempt this one. Is that there's one of the two, basically the only things that ultra or fundamentalist Jews and fundamentalist Muslims agree on is their kind of hatred of pigs and their hatred of gays in Israel. And this comes up every time there's a stabbing at the gay pride parades in Tel Aviv. And what's interesting is I found in this, the vilification of the pigs in Israel, I've just found really a similarity between the Muslim and the Jewish perspective, and it was not so much the case in the States. I felt there's more nuance, but I feel like that's like you have pig heads being thrown into mosques, in Israel, also into synagogues, and that's something that's happened, throughout history. I mean, so for me, I've been very interested in the similarities. And I know there are differences, and I created a website called Pork Memoirs, which was alluded to earlier, to collect stories from people about their personal relationship to pork, and I got a lot of responses from Jewish writers, Jewish readers, but I didn't get many. I didn't get many Muslim stories. And I was trying to solicit them, but there was this fear. There was a way that Muslims weren't comfortable talking about maybe transgressing or talk openly about, exploring the relationship to this creature, this animal, or any of that association. And I was very interested in that there was Jews loved talking about it, even if they didn't eat pigs. Someone accidentally got close to one and wrote a story, And so there's a different approach, but there is a similarity that I see it on the right-wing fundamentalist perspective.
And to answer my section very quickly, I would just say that, and I sort of hinted at this, how people focus on the Jewish aspect but miss the Muslim aspect. But I would say that it's a continuing signification being put into it. It's still a rhetoric of otherness and how it's being used. And that's the fascinating thing, is that pig continues to be used as a way of talking about self and other. And you can change some of the variables of things, but it's still functioning very similarly if you make an us of that.
I actually wanted to jump on these last two questions and what they're making me think about. It's striking to me how the actual way pigs are being raised and reflection upon it has not kind of come into interpreting these various identity issues. I think it's quite significant. If the pig stands for the despised other in these complicated ways, especially if you're saying things like, we have the Orthodox Jews' total hatred of pigs, more nuanced in the US. I mean, think of this in terms of other kind of political issues we might look at. It seems to me quite significant that we're not just eating the pig, we're dominating the pig in this radical way. And the stories you told, the details, it was such rich ethnography. I mean, think about this. The most famous pork farm in Israel begins with a pig that has made nothing, that has made lo klum. And I can't believe that these things are simply accidental. That is, at some unconscious level, if I am making a point of eating pork today as a point of identity in a nation which raises pork in a particular way, and there are associations, this is in part, I think tied into these very troubling and dark things. And when we forget the pig, I think we forget these things. So I think we bring back in the pig. Of course, the pig's going to be very concerned with its actual life. And if we look at that life and how it's treated, I think we'd see some remarkable parallels to the violence against humans and disregard for humans there.
Yeah, and one quick thing I would just say to that, which is, what's interesting is hearing that. It's so fascinating thinking about the experience of pigs in Israel. There are no pasture-raised pigs in the country, at least not legally produced. The Ministry of Agriculture really has no oversight over pork production. So some of these facilities are some of the most mismanaged facilities because it's a gray area in the law. It's quasi-legal, and no one's checking up on it. Thomas Friedman wrote about, when he covered this topic in the New York Times in the 80s, he called the Ministry of Agriculture to ask about pigs, and he likened it to as if he asked about cocaine, that it was impossible to get a single response. But these pigs are treated so poorly. I was on a farm that looked to EU standards. They looked to the West to guide them for how to morally raise pigs industrially. And the pig as a symbol has supplanted the pig as a creature, as an individual, and I really appreciate that.
I think that is fascinating. We have two more people with mics, maybe, and then Jim, maybe can round it off.
All right, very shortly. I'm so glad this Islam, Arab, Muslim majority perspective, that question was asked, because it's very obvious. The gap is, we need an Islam specialist on this one, and there isn't one. In the absence of the Islam specialist, I'm going to first turn to Jordan. Sorry, Jordan, for doing that.
I was a TA for Intro to Islam as a grad school, so let's see if I remember.
There you go. Okay, you are our specialist. So can you please enlighten us about, we have been talking about the similarities from Jewish perspective and Islamic perspective towards pig. Differences, and are we talking about similar kind of attitudes towards pork? Are we talking about similar kind of impurity? Are we talking about discussing or assuming that attitudes never differed between these two religious traditions or among communities who identified themselves between these two religious definitions, religious identities? That's aspect of it. One thing that I noticed in Jeffrey's presentation is this absence of this one major actor which was mentioned but not mentioned, these Arab Christians, this pre-existing group of people who are involved in this pig raising, and how is that community, how is that actor, this community of actors involved in this state of Israel's domestic pig industry? Just very briefly.
So quickly I think, so you're asking about how are variables different in understanding pig identification and attitude. So what I would say is the pig, it's not like the pig was consulted of how do you feel about being understood as a Jew, how do you feel about being understood as a Muslim, and things, right? So, but that gets back to some of the broader point that I was bringing out, that actually I was trying to point, I agree, Voice in Islam would be wonderful, because I was trying to point towards how it's funny how in discussions of pig identification, people, and it ends with the Huckabee thing, right, where he could have said a Jew and a Muslim how they would feel about being forced to eat. Like, he didn't have to go to another example. He had the same example could have worked for both, right? But there's a certain rendering invisibleness of that. But also part of that is it sort of does a disservice to both communities in that sense, right? Because it's rendering Islam invisible one way, but it's also forcing an essentialism of Judaism in another way. And what I'd say is that what you see is some similarities in how it's treated, but the pig is the signification thing. It can take on whatever symbol whoever wants to argue about it, and sometimes it'll be used to say a bad Jew is a pig, a bad Christian is like a Jew who or like a pig, a bad Muslim is a pig, or so it gets put on with so much signification that even within this quick historical lesson about Judaism, there are a lot of dissimilarities and things, and that's what I was trying to show how what's being indexed is often inverted. And so what I'd say is you can look for that, and you would have to see how it's continuously being inverted based on whatever's convenient for the accuser at the time vis-a-vis the pig.
Oh, sorry. Can we take a second on this question? And then Jim, thank you.
Yeah, this isn't a question, it's a very quick comment and an amplification on the signification of pigs. And that is, I don't know if anybody else is here's from the interior South or from the barbecue belt, but what you find in the advertising of barbecue joints is the use, I know yesterday Lori talked about the restaurant at the United Universe and the cow that sort of serves itself to customers, and what you find is something slightly similar but slightly different, which is that you find pig butchers as the sources of the barbecue that you're going to eat in the barbecue shack that you're going to eat in. So there's a wonderful in Lexington, I want to say it's called Stamey's, but anyway, there's a wonderful large life-size, well, larger than life-size, human-size statue of a pig in a toque and a butcher's cleaver, and you're going to walk in and eat pig. And I always I've always seen this as in effect an extension of being kosher, and not so much as a violation of it, but rather evidence of the fact that pork consumption is itself transgressive, that there's a way in which what makes it possible to eat that pig, even for barbecue and Bible Belt eating Christians, is a recognition of the transgressive character of that. That is that cannibalism is something that is akin to lends itself to the pig, and the pig exemplifies cannibalism in a way that you don't see the same kind of advertising with other kinds of animals, for example, that you do with pigs.
Right, I mean, it's the inversion of the Chick-fil-A thing, right, where you have the cow saying eat more chicken. But also I'd add to that just quickly that ancient rabbinic sources and Jewish sources all acknowledge that pig is the most tastiest of all meats. And in fact, they say it's important theologically for you to acknowledge that, because then you are saying you are choosing, because God commanded it, to not eat the most tasty meat. But of course, in theory, they're having to claim that it's based on other people's evidence. But even one quick little zooarchaeological thing, as I was saying this earlier, is that pig bones, everyone wants to talk about pig bones and Jewish identity, and they say, look, there's less pig bones in this site, so it must be Jewish, and they ignore the fact that there'll be all these other non-kosher bones being slaughtered in the same place, in the same house, but no one wants to talk about it, because look, oh, it's less pig bones, they must be observant Jews, as if that's the only symbol of it, and let's ignore all the other non-kosher animals that they're eating.
Yeah.
So we have one last comment.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to the question of how identity is marked. And I have thought theoretically if you wanted to invent a set of rules that would prevent your people from eating with another people, you couldn't do much better than Jewish dietary rules historically, right? And so the question is, there are all kinds of ways of marking identity. Some sects historically in Southeast Asia by a different set of clothes, some by how they bathe, and so on, that don't prevent them from eating with other people. And so what is interesting, I suppose, is the food prohibition because once people are eating with one another, there's no telling what they might do. And so the food prohibition seems to me to have a particular effect as a marker that other forms of self-identification and boundaries do not necessarily have, and therefore it seems to me to have something of a different status.
Right. And in fact, the ancient rabbis, the my guys, they knew it. There's this text that actually a scholar here, Chris Hayes, has worked on in her first book, that where basically the rabbis say, what if you're invited to a idolater's wedding feast? Can you go to it? And they say no. And it says, what if I bring my own food so it's kosher? And I bring my own servants. So it's not about the food. And they say, no, not allowed. And the idea being that whole event is not kosher, right? But they're clearly saying, okay, you're saying no because it's the food. Or there's another text where they say, wine is not allowed because of idolatrous wine because they're going to pour out a little libation. So what about beer or any other non-wine intoxicant which is not used in any libation forms? And so the rabbis say, well, you can't, and the answer is mishum chatanu, which means because of intermarriage. And then they say there are two rabbis, one more strict than the other. So one would go to a Gentile bar, order his beer, stand outside the bar, get them to bring it out, and then drink it there. The other one was a little more strict, so he would wait till he got home and crossed the threshold of his house, and then he'd drink it. And so that text so unambiguously says it's about the social. Yeah. In fact, the food itself is kosher. It's sitting down next to him and saying, "Oh, hey, you're really, maybe you have a sister. Let's chat about this." And it's saying that you can't go to a bar, and it's all about the social situation. So they're clearly acknowledging that. So it's not even just you reading into it; they say it.
Would any of the panelists like to comment on because the food actually for us has just arrived, but we're still setting things up. So if there are any maybe comments or questions?
I just wanted to make a quick. The gentleman actually still has the mic who is bringing up in the context of the South these interesting images of pigs participating in their own slaughter. I think we need. There's a whole literature on African Americans and pigs, and the incident which came up in Jordan's. It's a literature I'm not yet familiar with, but I certainly know part of what it's bound up with is the way the domination of pigs and the domination of blacks comes together. And I think we really, these questions of identification are so important, and I think they are what scholars can bring to the table of ultimately the pragmatic decisions that share our. But we do have a tendency to forget these macro frames in which things are occurring in. And I just want to call our attention to that again.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Maybe Jeffrey.
I just wanted to respond to the Christian Arab question. I didn't mean to leave it hanging. What's interesting is I guess there's really a tradition of raising pigs in the north of Israel among these Christian Arab communities, and I feel like one of the effects of this law and then the partnerships that developed between the secular Israeli kibbutzim bringing their pigs to this region and with these Christian Arabs is that way of agriculture seemed to have really no longer exists. It's all become industrialized because of the concentration of the industry. So what's sad is that you really can't go and find these old traditional agricultural methods. It's also really hard to visit this region because the entire industry is veiled in secrecy. It takes different networks of connections to finally find someone. And I was supposed to, I was going to the region. I was meeting with a farmer, and I was 10 minutes late to this meeting point, and then he would never call me back again. And people are really scared and nervous. And these Christian Arab regions have really been sort of like a lot of the communities in North Carolina that are near some of the big CAFOs. They really, these areas are incredibly polluted, and it's really a big problem that no one's really talking about because it's just not something that's really talked about openly. I would just say that the whole industry itself is even though now it's more legal than it was, but it's still not entirely legal. These exemptions to get onto that pig farm, Kibbutz Lahav, I had to. I wasn't allowed. They wouldn't let me on. They were worried I was religious. When I tried calling just to visit for a day or two, the only way I could get onto the farm was to sign up as a kibbutz volunteer, and I then had to get a letter from my rabbi in New Jersey and a certificate of my bar mitzvah to then prove that I could become a volunteer at the kibbutz programs office to then go on work on this pig farm, for free as a kibbutz volunteer to do my research. Because no one would let me in. So not much is known about the Christian Arab pig farmers. There hasn't been that much written. And from my discussions with a few Christian Arab pig farmers, it's not something that they really want to put out there. I will say there is an interesting tradition of Christian Arabs in the north hunting boar. And it's illegal to serve hunted boar in any restaurant, although there are a lot of subversive chefs in Tel Aviv who have big boar roasts on Yom Kippur. And the chef Lior Hargil of Haminzar, and he has his hunter in the north who brings him whenever he's got a catch. So whatever. So that's kind of a little. I wish I had a better answer. It's really hard to know because of that those layers of secrecy.
Okay, maybe the final question before we break for lunch. Yes.
It's more a comment than a question, but it's interesting from a paleogenomic perspective that when pigs first arrive in the Levant, they are clearly of Near Eastern origin, as Ben was discussing. They're from Anatolia, and they're coming further down. And then in the Iron Age, there's a massive migration of European pigs that come into the Levant before then domestic pigs start to disappear from that region. But when you look at the wild boar from the region, they are all effectively feral pigs from domestic pigs that were from Europe. So they have a really interesting genetic mixture between an ultimate Near Eastern origin, but mixed with a significant European one. And the colleague of mine in Israel who was doing this work was really struggling to even discuss this, because even though we're talking about 2, 3, 4, or 5,000 years ago, the whole idea that there were ever domestic pigs in the Levant thousands of years prior to the origin of Israel as a religion was somehow, you can't talk about pigs at all. And so she was struggling to get research money to investigate this, even though the nature of the wild boar in the region is fascinating and would point a great deal toward understanding the whole history of human migration in the area and the relationship between humans and animals in the region writ large. So it's just kind of an interesting thing that she couldn't even tell people what she was doing, even though it was thousands of years prior to it.
Right, thank you. We'd like to thank the panel again for a very lively discussion.